figured I was right here. I could do it.
Amen. Except for sure. Amen.
All right. Good morning, gentlemen. Figure we can probably get started. Good to see everybody. My name's Josh. I get the privilege of kind of leading through this morning. Before we get into that, just want to say welcome to everyone. Any first timers here for Springs men's ministry stuff? No? Awesome. Well, thanks guys for coming. Appreciate it very much. Just so you know, kind of the rhythm of how men's ministry at the Springs works is we get together once a month for like a Saturday morning breakfast thing like this. We also get together once a week on Wednesday mornings and go through a study, and then there's also a once a month men's lunch that happens as well. So it's pretty sweet because there's several contact points that you can make get onto the church. It's a really, really great group of guys. So like I said, my name is Josh. The reason I'm speaking is that I moved here from the Seattle area back in December, and when I lived in Seattle, my family and I, we were part of Mars Hill Church for about 11 years, the last 2 of which I spent in leadership. So some of you guys probably know that name. Some of you may not, just out of curiosity. No judgment or embarrassment, but anyone never heard of Mars Hill or Mark Driscoll? Like, just no idea what you're talking about. Awesome. Cool. Okay.
Never heard of it.
Okay. What about John's sermon on Sunday, like, prompted that?
He just mentioned it and said, some of you or most of you have heard about Mars Hill.
Huh.
Yeah. Seriously, I thought he said Forest Hill, and I Googled that until I figured out it was Mars Hill.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd never heard of it, but my daughter, I guess, has listened to this big, lengthy podcast.
Yeah.
That goes into great detail.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay, awesome. Well, yeah, I think, what I'm going to do is just tell a little bit about the story, of the church and my story, my family's story, and kind of how we intersected with it. It was a really interesting experience, and there was actually a podcast, you guys probably heard us reference it, that was put out called The Rise and Fall of Mars Hill, and that generated a lot of interest and sort of created like this sort of national buzz around the story of the church. And so we'll talk a little bit about why that even happened and what was significant about it. But if you guys don't mind, let's maybe open in prayer, and then we can jump in. So, Father, thank you so much for this day that you have given us. Thank you for the life that each of us share, and thank you for the new life that you have given us in Jesus. God, we are grateful that you are a God who is an author of stories, and that each of our stories is really part of your story, and yours is one of love and of grace and of redemption. And so I pray for our time this morning that you would move me out of the way, and that as I share and as we share, that each of us would come away from this morning with fuller hearts that are just more inclined to worship you. God, I pray that we would just see your fingerprints, your mighty works of redemption and deliverance in each of our lives through the things that we talk about and that we share this morning. So we love you. We just invite you to lead this time and to make it fruitful for us. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, so a little bit of background. So Mars Hill was a church in Seattle that was started in 1996, and by 2013, it was over 13,000 people. The last year, I guess, in 14, that Easter, I think we'd crested pretty well over 15,000 people, and it was across 15 different campuses in 4 states. Right, so it was enormous. It was pretty big. And so, like I said before, it kind of begs the question, like, why was it worthy of a podcast? There's been other big churches, that have grown and then have receded or have gone away. What was it about Mars Hill, that was unique, and why was it chronicled in a podcast? And there's blog posts, and there's so much stuff online about it, and there's just a lot of interest and stuff that's out there. And I think there's a couple of reasons. We could probably be here all morning if we wanted to talking about them, but there's 3 that I would isolate, I guess, that made Mars Hill unique. One was just the reality of Mark Driscoll. So Mark Driscoll was the guy who founded Mars Hill. He was the main guy, the teaching pastor through its whole life. And he's just a really interesting guy, very, very dynamic, tremendously gifted preacher, visionary, just had it, and you know it when you see it. The problem is that for all of his gifts and talents, they were met with some pretty significant character defects and flaws as well, that played a fairly instrumental role in the ultimate downfall. And so we'll talk about that later. But just the reality of Mark was definitely a big part of it, because Mark's nature is, he describes himself as pugilistic, right? And so he had this sort of brash, unapologetic countenance to him that was just very unique, at the time that the church was coming up. But that's kind of the second thing is that makes it significant. It's just the cultural context of what was happening in the Western American church when Mars Hill was coming up, right? So it started, in the 90s, and at that time, there weren't that many, mega churches out there. I mean, there were some, but there weren't any. But what was significant is, you guys remember in the late 90s, 2000s, that's when digital media, was becoming a thing. Right now we think of Facebook and YouTube and all that. It's just sort of there. Those things weren't always there, and so prior to the digital media age, sermons were on tapes. That you could buy, in the foyer when you left, right? And so as Mars Hill is sort of ascending and coming up, so is YouTube, and so are podcasts, and so are all these things. And the church very deliberately sort of made a strategic decision, hey, we want to use these things, right? And so it created sort of this global awareness and this sort of, this global dynamic where Mars Hill just wasn't a church in one city, but because of, Mark's gifting plus technology, it was just all over the place, and so just tons of people knew about it. And, I still run into people who's never set foot in a Mars Hill, but I listened to over 100 sermons or, whatever. And so I feel like I was shaped by it, or I grew by it, or whatnot. The church was also, it kind of wrote the playbook on multi-site, ministry. I mean, 15 campuses across 4 states. That's a tough nut to crack, right? And the church did. And so that kind of put it at a place of, influence, I guess, or leadership in the church. It was also kind of in the Reformed sort of strain. And again, most mega churches historically have not been, from that particular tribe, and so Mark and Mars Hill sort of made that neo-Reformed camp cool again, for lack of a better word, and that's the reality of it. And so the last thing that I would say that made it unique was Mark's focus on, and the church's, sort of focus or highlighting of complementarianism. If you don't know what complementarianism is, it's just a word to describe, sort of how gender roles are worked out in the church, right? So you usually have complementarianism here, you have egalitarianism on the other side. I'm not here to debate, the benefits of those. That'll be for another question. But, complementarianism basically holds that men and women are completely equal in dignity and value and worth, but that they have distinct roles to be played in family life and church life and all that kind of stuff. That was something that was really put forward pretty aggressively, at Mars Hill. And Mark was pretty unabashed about saying I'm going after the men. I care about the men, right? And that just spoke to a lot of young men's hearts, like mine, who are in their 20s, who really wanted to know, what does biblical manhood look like? Because for a lot of us, I didn't grow up in the South, so I can't talk about what the dynamic was like here, but I'm here to tell you guys, on the West Coast, coming up in the 80s and 90s, hard to describe it, but it's just there's kind of a softness, I guess, in the church that just left a lot of guys kind of wanting more about man, where does manhood and masculinity intersect, with the gospel and all that. We weren't getting a lot of answers, and so Mars Hill comes along and Mark comes along and starts answering some pretty deep fundamental questions, in men's lives. So if you want more about kind of the dynamics of Mars Hill, what made it interesting, listen to the podcast, because it's, I don't know, what is it, 15 episodes of an hour and a half long. So there's a truckload of content on there. So I definitely recommend doing that. In terms of my story, and kind of how it intersects with all this. I found my way to Mars Hill in 2003, so I would have been 23 at the time. I was raised in a pretty lightweight kind of Christian environment, so I had a general sort of roundabout idea of God and Jesus that loves me. And I remember being in third grade, asking Jesus into my heart and, all that kind of stuff. But the reality is I didn't have a really robust understanding of the gospel. And so my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, God's grace, we were in Seattle. We were attending a small church in Seattle that was heading pretty quickly just kind of towards like the sort of postmodern kind of sort of liberal theology track. You guys know who Brian McLaren is? Anyone ever heard that name? Yeah, thank you. So yeah, he wrote a book called A New Kind of Christian that was sort of this first big like application of postmodernism, into spirituality. It was just kind of like this decoupling of like we don't need to trust the Bible and like all that kind of stuff. And so it's weird because we're at this church and we don't really know any better, but we're just like thinking to ourselves like, just seems like the opposite way of like where we want to be going, but we couldn't put our finger on, why or how. And so we're wrestling through that. A friend of mine calls me and says, "Hey, you need to come to church with me on Sunday." I was like, "Why? I have a church." And he's like, "No, you didn't come." He goes, "The pastor swears in his sermons." And I was like, "What time?" Yes, I'm here for that. Like, let's go. Yeah. And so my girlfriend and I start attending, basically we go to Mars Hill at night and we go to the other church in the morning, for, I don't know, it's probably 4 to 6 weeks. And it was a really interesting time because it was really two very contrasting experiences. And the reality is that when, for those first 4 to 6 weeks, no joke, you guys, every time we left a service at Mars Hill, just left broken and just in tears, right? And it was in a good way because for the first time we were hearing the fullness of the gospel preached. We began learning about just the majesty and the wonder and the glory of God. We began learning about total depravity and our sin and what that costs. We began learning about, the life of Jesus, what he actually accomplished on the cross and in his resurrection. I mean, just these rich, beautiful theological things applied to our lives that we had just never really heard before, and it was just really intense, and it was really good, and it was really beautiful. And so we kind of decided, like, okay, we're going to push all of our chips in and start going to Mars Hill. And it was funny because right when we got there, Mark was just starting a series on the book of Genesis. And this is another thing where, like, leading up to this time, like, you would have asked me about, like, what's Genesis? I'm like, I don't know, just some old stories. You got Noah and, Abraham and, there's some songs that go with it, I think. And, that was about it, I was like, maybe some fairy tale, kind of things. And as Mark, like, took us through it, I like, my brain just my soul just started to explode because I just began to realize, like, wow, like, there's so much, beauty embedded in this, and we got this incredible just sort of boot camp of what biblical manhood looks like, right? Because so much of the narrative in Genesis is men and God's people and their faithlessness and God's covenant faithfulness, right? In their response, right? I'd never seen that before, right? I began to learn about biblical theology, right? Which is how the Bible, the arc and the narrative and the storyline, how it all ties together, right? It began to, like, be taught how Genesis has more than one pointer to Jesus in it, right? Like, you just look at the story of Abraham and Isaac, right? And the sacrifice of Isaac. There's like 11 parallels between that and the passion of Jesus Christ. Never had seen that before, right? The way that Joseph is a type or a pointer, right? To, like, the Christ figure, and so we're just like, oh my gosh, like, there's so much richness to be found in the Bible that we just did not know, was there before. It was really, really, it was tremendous. So we jump in and start throwing ourselves at it and start plugging in. And over the course of the next several years, I basically kind of launched myself on sort of a self-guided, seminary tour, I guess, where I just began to ingest anything and everything that I possibly could because I wanted to learn more. Like mine was a soul that had been changed and transformed by the gospel in a meaningful way. It was, and I wanted more of that. And, you guys probably know, those of you that are parents, if you have kids, you probably know that, oftentimes like our kids, they just want to be about dad's business. Like if you are out in the backyard, like building a shed, your kid comes out and it's just like, hey dad, like what are you doing? Like kind of hammering a nail, like that's just the nature of it. And so I think that is sort of one of our natural responses sometimes, when we encounter the gospel in its fullness, for the first time, we just want to be about dad's business. And so that was me. And so I just start listening to, back then I had to drive almost 2 hours a day, so I had a ton of commute time. And so I'm just ingesting as many sermons as I can of, all of Driscoll's old stuff and John Piper and Alistair Begg and, anyone else I could get, my hands on. I'm reading books. I'm reading, Wayne Grudem's systematic theology, for fun, not because anyone told me to, so I'm just like, I'm grinding away. And, yeah, it was one of those like seasons of life where I went from like, cause I think functionally like I was saved there, even though like I said, I'd grown up in the church or whatnot. I never really had my head wrapped around the gospel until then. And so, what ended up happening is when we started at Mars Hill, like serving was a big thing, right? And it was kind of funny because you all know how like in Israel, when you become a certain age, you basically have to like, serve in the military, like the IDF or whatever. Mars Hill was kind of like that, like with younger guys, where if you came to the church, you didn't have anywhere to start serving, it was security for you. Like that was it. Like dudes just had to work security. And one of the reasons is that the Mars Hill, when we started going there, it was only one campus, but it was in this pretty seedy neighborhood of Seattle, and we were like up to 5 services, right? So we do 3 in the morning and 2 at night, and the second night service started at 7, right? And so that means it was getting out at 9, and it was just it was just gnarly, like I got so much respect and thanks for like the guys that serve on security here, but it was just a different context because every single week we had, multiple security and like issues, right? There were guys that tried to get up on the stage at least once a month, right? So we're wrestling dudes that are trying to like interrupt the sermon. There was one guy who came once who had literally broken out of a mental hospital, and he had all these like wounds on his arms, so he's like bleeding and all that stuff, and he comes like stumbling into the church. This kind of thing was just like, was regular, right? And so everyone was like, we need more bodies, and so they just started, throwing us at it. And so, started serving on security, and, over the course of a couple of years, I actually ended up leading the whole ministry, which was very odd because I have no background in law enforcement or anything like that. I'm just a dude. I've been in one fight in my life and I lost, right? So it's like, I'm not the guy. But what I found is that I was on the fly. I was learning how to lead men, and like I knew how to coordinate teams, and when I got there, it was like, hey, here's a jacket, here's a radio, here's a lanyard. Don't do anything that could get the church sued. And that was it. Like that was training, right? Get out there. And I was like, I think we could probably do a little better than that, and so I started bringing in experts and guys that, help, do trainings and got our insurance squared away and, all that kind of stuff. So anyway, I served in that capacity for a number of years, and it was great, and I loved it. But then what started happening is Mars Hill started going multi-campus, right, and multi-site, right? And so, different campuses started getting launched, and one of the most significant ones was launched in Bellevue, because the way that Seattle area geography is you have the city of Seattle, you have a big lake called Lake Washington, you have what's called the East Side, right? And Bellevue is sort of the anchor city, for the East Side. You guys have probably heard of Microsoft there in Redmond, which is another big city, that's out there. But for the longest time, Mark was like, yeah, we're never going to the East Side. They're just a bunch of like soft, decadent, whatever. It was kind of weird. And eventually, he was like, no, like actually we could, cause there were tons of people that were commuting, over the water. And so, when that first campus in Bellevue was started, we were living on the East Side at the time. And so we decided to join up with it. And it was at that time that I just felt God kind of pushing on my heart, like, hey, like you've got the Sunday operations piece down, and I just wanted to grow in shepherding. I wanted to grow in learning, just how to help apply the gospel of grace and hope to people's lives. And so, for me, like the obvious sort of way to jump in there was just leading a small group, right? And so this new campus that was starting didn't have any, and so I went to the guy who was the lead pastor, and I just said like, hey man, like we're coming over, I'd love to get a small group started. And he was like, great, let me know what you need. And so we did, and there's just a bunch of crazy stuff happened there that I can get to later. I want to be mindful of time, but yeah.
These other campuses, was there a separate pastor at that, or did you all watch your TV screen?
Good question. Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, so question is kind of how how the campus dynamic worked and teaching all that stuff. Yeah, so the way that it worked is that Mark was always piped in on Sundays, right? So we had big screen, like we have here. Instead of having a live pastor there, you would have the sermon come through on the screen. Every so often, he'd be out of the pulpit or whatever, and so each campus had its own what was called the lead pastor. Right, so they were kind of like the main guy, for that campus, and so that guy would then have the opportunity to teach if Mark was out of the pulpit, live. But that was definitely the exception, not the rule. Yeah, that's a really good question. And so so I start this community group, and it's crazy, it's. Again, I have stories for you if you want them after, but God was gracious, to us, and the group grew. And the way that we did community groups is a little different than we do it at the Springs, where every group is always open, right? So people can just come, right, whenever. And so what that did is that created this what we call this replication dynamic, where as groups continually grew, you had to raise up new leaders, split the groups in half, saying, okay, you 12 go over here, we're going to stay over here, right? And then you just do that again. And so I was able to do that. Our group grew, got up to 30 people. I raised up this, other guy who was a leader, kind of taught him, what I knew about leading, which wasn't much, and then replicated him out, and it worked. And it was great. And so I was kind of the first one to do that. And so what happened then is the church leadership, at our campus came to me and said, look, we're in this unique dynamic where, we planted this campus and there's 1,000 people coming straight away, because there's all these people that had been commuting over the water, and now they have a campus on the east side. And so we went from 0 to 1,000 in a month, and so there was all these people who wanted to be in small groups on the east side, but didn't have any groups. And so the church came to me and said, hey, you seem to know what you're doing. We want you to go and start planting small groups all over the place, on the east side. And so I kind of became this weird, small group apostle, I guess. I don't know, how else you, I know that sounds weird. I'm not saying that in a prideful way, but that was literally the goal. And so for several years, that's what I did. I would literally just go, if you look at a map, you have Bellevue, and I lived kind of in the southern area in a place called Renton. And so I just sort of took the south, and I just went to one community, Newcastle, and just said all right, anyone who goes to Marcel Newcastle, be here at this night. And boom, 58 people would show up. I'd have to get them organized into a group, and so I would, and I was okay, who's got a house big enough to host, okay, I do, cool, couple of guys, you guys think you might want to lead, come meet with me. And so I'd start meeting with those guys and teaching those guys how to lead and all that kind of stuff. And I'd spend 3 or 4 months there, get that up and going, you guys good? Okay, boom. I go on to the next town, Renton, hands up. Okay, next town, Fairwood, Maple Valley, and so it would be if we were here, just going from Cibolo to Shirts to, whatever, just trying to get believers together, to meet together. Cause you guys know, you hear it all the time, hopefully hear the importance of being in community, right? You can't experience church in its fullest context just by coming on Sunday, you just can't. And,
Amen.
And thank you. And Marcel believed that. And so this was a very, very, dynamic time, because again, I was just this young dude who didn't know anything, but I just wanted to be about Dad's business, and God was gracious, and He blessed, the work that I did, and so it was one of the sweetest times in our time at Mars Hill. But this unique dynamic then started to happen where the elders at Mars Hill. And so just to kind of clarify one thing, because I know eldership can kind of mean different things to different people. Mars Hill did its best to practice what we called biblical eldership, right? And so that's the idea that elders are, yes, leading and kind of governing the church, but they are also men who are in the lives of the people, of the church, right? So, we don't need to get into any polity debates here, but some churches have a little bit more of a CEO model where you have a lead pastor, and elders are really just kind of rich old guys, who tell the lead pastor, if it's okay to put carpet down, but they're not actually in the lives of the people, ministering the gospel, right? So we kind of rejected that. We're no, elders need to be people there. And so the elders of Mars Hill approached me and said hey, would you consider being open to pursuing this office, right? And I was yeah, no, and heck no, there's no way, because at Mars Hill, there was very much I don't know, man, the elders and the pastors there were just larger than life, You know, like these guys were just so talented, and just, I was like, I'm not that. I'm just this dude, you know, like who just got saved basically, and I'm just like kind of legging it out, like doing my best. And so I just resisted, you know, that invitation, you know, for a long time. But eventually, you know, one of the guys who became kind of one of my really good friends and mentors, he sat me down, he explained to me, he goes, this is something that you need to do, and you're making it about you. In reality, you are serving, all of the people in the South End as a pastor and an elder already, right? Because all of these groups that I had helped get started, I just sort of became sort of their go-to. You know, I began just sort of ministering to them in the way that an elder ministers, right? So if there if there was like a marriage that was falling apart, like I was the one that got called and I went in there. Or if like, you know, like someone got sick and like someone needed to visit in the hospital, like I was the one that went. You know, like I officiated funerals, like I was kind of doing all these things. And so the leadership just sort of helped me see, like, look, like you're already sort of living in this capacity. It will be a blessing to the people for them to see sort of that recognition, you know, for them to sort of see like, the church recognize you like in that way. And so I was like, wow, like, okay. I still didn't want to do it, but I was like, okay. Now, at the time, Mars Hill had this very famously brutal, like, assessment process, right? It wasn't just like, hey, here's an interview, like, cool, here's your hat, good enough. I mean, it was like, a year plus reading books, doing like boot camps, like, I mean, they did all these crazy interviews, like backdoor reference checks, like, you know, all these different things. And it was just really intense. And so I was like, okay, like, I'm an idiot. I'm a knucklehead. They're going to find something, you know, in this process that they don't like, and so like I'll be off the hook. Well, they didn't, right? And so I was like, okay. So, you know, I
told them about that fight you lost.
I know. You think that would have done it, but they never asked. I know. They never asked. It was all the way back in high school, but yeah. I know. That would have done it. Thank you. Yeah. So anyway, so I submit to the process and I go through it and I end up getting approved. And I mean, I would have been 31, I think, you know, at the time. And it was really hard and it was really beautiful, you know, at the same time. You know, I continued to just sort of, you know, be sort of that regional, you know, pastor for, you know, for the people in my geographic area. But then I also, you know, had the privilege of serving in a bunch of other areas too, you know, and, it was just really sweet. It was really sweet, and it was really hard. Like I said, in a lot of ways, I made a lot of mistakes that I can get into if you guys want to, kind of at the end in Q&A. Again, I want to be respectful of time. But yeah, by and large, I just felt like God's gracious hand, you know, was on me and allowed me or equipped me to serve and love, you know, a lot of people, and it was really awesome. It was really beautiful. So it just kind of went on like that for a while, and then issues, you know, started to arise. And, you know, you guys probably, if you listen to the pod, you got a sense of kind of the brokenness that was embedded, you know, in Mark's character. But those things that previously had been sort of kept quarantined and isolated started to spill over.
The podcast about
the rise and fall.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just making sure if it wasn't like apparent in his podcast that he was preaching from the pulpit. Gotcha.
Yeah. A lot of the stuff is chronicled, you know, in the rise and fall, and so I can talk more in detail about kind of what brought it down in the end. But we stayed just about until the end, and it was hard because all along the way, you know, a question I get asked a lot of times is like, was it ever hard for you? You know, like before the end. You know, was it ever hard? You know, just serving in that kind of environment. And the answer is like, hell yeah, like it was hard. Like if my wife were here, like she would tell you that like all the time that I was in leadership and even before that and after that and all that, like all the time I would come home and just say like, I don't know if I can keep doing it. Like it's like just something else, some bomb went off, Driscoll just did, and I just be like, I don't know if I can keep doing it. And then sure enough, like that week, you know, something else would happen in the community that I was living and serving, and it was just like, no, like I need to be here. Like it was for the people, you know, because God had just created this incredibly, you know how like at the Springs, you know how like, I don't know if you guys, I love this church, but you know how like one of the dynamics of the Springs is like, this is not a great place to come if you just want to coast. You know, you guys kind of get that vibe. Like if you don't get that vibe, like I'm sorry, but that's kind of the reality. Like Springs is like it just attracts people that are earnest, right? That that want to plug in, that want to grow, that want to love Jesus and live, or whatever the tagline is, but doing it together. And Mars Hill was kind of like that. There weren't a lot of people that were just sort of coasting, and you guys probably know the dynamic where it's nice to be surrounded by other people that are eager, and that are pressing in and that want to grow and want to learn. And so that was what the dynamic was like. And that was largely one of the things that, that kept us there, despite a lot of really, really hard kind of broken stuff, that was going on. So, okay. So the end. So what ultimately brought down Mars Hill? Like I said, I mean, it got to, over 13,000 people at its heyday. And then in a year, just turn into nothing. How does that happen? In February of 14, I was in Ethiopia on an international missions trip that we were going there. And while we were there, the first big World Mag is like a Christian Newsweek or Time Magazine, I guess is the best way to put it. Big expose on all of the drama, I guess, behind the scenes stuff at Mars Hill. That broke. Up to that point, there had been a fair number of stuff online or in the news, but it was all pretty local. There was this guy named Warren Throckmorton in Seattle that kind of made himself the chief whistleblower, of everything that was happening in Mars Hill. But he was pretty localized and contained, and so we just kind of learned to live with that. But the World Mag thing was the first big national awareness boom thing that hits. And so after that, a bunch of other news organization stuff started sniffing around and jumping on, and that was kind of the beginning of the end. That was when things just started to pile up. And so again, if you listen to the pod, you're probably, familiar with a lot of the stuff that happened, but there was the Result Source scandal, which was basically where Mark, hired a firm to boost his marriage book up in the New York Times, and they used church money to buy, a bunch of these books, in order to make it on the bestseller list. There was the whole Strange Fire thing where Driscoll went down to a John MacArthur conference or whatever and just kicked up a bunch of dust. He had a bunch of plagiarism issues. There was the whole Mars Hill Global thing where we had this fund that we called Mars Hill Global that ended up kind of treated like a slush fund. I mean, it was just a bunch of different things. And so you have this sort of cascading effect. But bigger than all of those one-off scandal things, the thing that was really, really pulling down and sinking the church was Mark's, it was just his abusive, domineering leadership style. It was one of those things where you had this dichotomy of a person who presented, on a stage was one person, and a person behind closed doors in meetings was a different person. Right? And again, at the Springs, we talk a lot about integrity, right? What is integrity? It's being the same person in every situation, right? And that just wasn't the case, with Mark. And so there was this graveyard, for lack of a better term, of people who had been churned up in the gears, of working, at Mars Hill. And there were a lot of really, really hurt people there. And a lot of really hurt people that have been kind of cast aside and left behind. And for a long time, the church was able to just kind of, again, isolate and quarantine. But eventually those voices, thankfully, got loud enough to start to be heard.
Podcast,
Yeah.
he got kicked off the bus and the bus ran over.
Yeah. So that was one of his famous quotes. Yeah, that was one of his famous quotes is, you either get on the bus or the bus is going to run over you. And it was hard because he said it in a very arrogant, bragging, kind of pugilistic way of just I'm proud of all the necks that I've stepped on, over the years. And so it was hard because that created this sort of this crisis of conscience, in a lot of people. Because on the one hand, God was just doing these manifestly awesome works, in the lives of so many people. I mean, I can't even tell you how many dudes I know that were like me that walked into Mars Hill, basically little boys who could shave. That's the way that Mark put it, right? So many men are just little boys in here who have a man's body, right? And we show up and just radical transformation starts happening, and there were a lot of those. And, we just saw marriages restored. I mean, there were people that I knew who had gotten divorced and then remarried each other because of their intersection with the gospel and with the risen Lord, with Jesus and all that stuff. So, so it was tough. One of the other things is, so when people ask, I guess, like what was it fundamentally that kind of brought it down? People are going to have different answers. Like, one of the things that I sort of come back to is that at the end of the day, I believe that Mark, there was one lie that he had let himself slide. He believed a lot of lies, to be sure, but the one sort of critical one that he let himself slide into believing was that Mars Hill was his church. Like he believed that. Like, he lost sight of the reality that the church is the bride of Jesus, and that pastors exist to steward and to love and to serve that bride. He forgot that. And he began to believe that it was his. And as you know, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And he began to just get intoxicated, I think, with fame, power, influence, prestige, whatever you want to call it, right? And it just kind of carried him away. And so that's part of it. The other part of it is the organizational structure around Mark was very enabling. It just was. We were told up and down about how he had accountability and there were people speaking into his life, and just that was never true. He was a bully, and he was able to control and manipulate anyone and everyone that was put into his life to try and rein him in. So anyway, so the 2014 was kind of the year that everything started to come down. And it was hard, because as I was serving, and as the other elders that I, served with, as we were all serving together, probably 70 to 80% of what we were doing was just trying to gently and graciously, like, move people to the exits. Right? And that's hard. That's hard. It's hard to, like, every Sunday. I mean, we really did our best to, like, encourage people, like, it's okay to leave. I don't know, like, what your sort of theology of like church membership looks like, but if you're a member of a church, like, if you feel God calling you, like, away from that church, like, for some reason, I think, like, it's really fruitful to do that in a way that's, like, in relationship with the leaders of that church, and to come and just say, like, hey, like, I think God's calling us away. Like, would you pray about that, like, with us, and, like, confirm that, and so that way, like, you can kind of be sent, and just, like, and it's all love, and the door's still open, and, all that kind of stuff. And so we were doing our best to just gently, not in a, like, you need our permission, but just in a loving kind of, like, hey, like, if you feel like it's time for you to go, we understand, but, like, come, like, let's pray about it together, let's talk. And so that was just the majority of the work that we were doing the last year. I was just running around with a fire extinguisher and trying to be like a Driscoll apologist, and like, well, he didn't quite mean what he said, and just, like, it was exhausting, and it was just really hard. And so in the end, the podcast kind of chronicles all this, but a group of elders at Mars Hill got together and basically began a formal investigation into, like, a bunch of charges that had been leveled against Mark, particularly as it relates to arrogance and domineering, approach to ministry and all that kind of stuff. And they found that by and large, like, most of it was true. And so they started to put together a restoration plan, for him, where he would step out of ministry, for a while, and hopefully get help and counseling. And the goal was always restorative. It was never designed to be punitive. And right kind of when that was delivered, Mark just said, all right, peaced out, and left. And so the obvious thing to do, so much damage had been done by that point. The membership base had, lost more than half of its members. It just made sense to just close down the church entirely. And it was, 15 campuses. And so some of those were then kind of, like, spun out into just independent freestanding churches, where, like, those lead pastors could then just carry that forward, into, like, its own independent church. But some of them just closed down. Those lead pastors were just burnt out and, couldn't do it. And so, those churches just became nothing. And so that's hard. It's hard. You spend 11 years, just giving, you got to keep in mind, like, I was never on staff, right? I was doing everything that I described, I was doing as a volunteer. I had a day job. I had a young family, and so, like, I was pouring almost everything I had, into this thing, and to just see it just go up, like, that's hard. But God was gracious and he was merciful. I often get the question, what kept us there? I know I kind of alluded to this, before. There's sort of two pieces to why we stayed. One, I sort of already described of just, I feel like was this godly motivation. I felt connected to the people there, and I just never really felt that sense of release of God just telling me like, hey, like you could just go. Even though it was hard, I wanted to stay embedded, with those people and loving and serving them. But there was also like a sinful, like fleshy part of it too, where I liked being in the mix. Like I told you guys, like I was a nobody, still am, right? Mars Hill was something, right? It had like global buzz. And there was something titillating to my flesh when I could tell people like, yeah, I'm an elder there. What are you doing? And it was gross. It's nasty, but it was there. I liked being in the nucleus, I guess, being an elder. Like it gave me access to leadership. I got to speak into, decisions and strategies and, different stuff like that. And like, I liked that. I did. And so, I gotta be realistic about that. There were really good, godly, spirit-filled things, I think, that kept me there, but there was also pretty fleshy, sinful things as well. And that's just the reality. So, all right. So I'll transition now, if it's okay. I'm trying to be mindful of time. But I'm going to transition now just in talking about like, just some lessons, I guess, and some takeaways. I know, yeah, go ahead. Yeah, good question. What happened to Mark Driscoll is the question. So Mark ended up resigning from Mars Hill. He moved his family to Arizona, and he started another church in Scottsdale called Trinity that is still going today. It's how much to say about that? A bunch of ex-Mars Hill guys, myself included, all signed a letter a little over a year ago, just asserting that we don't think that Mark is fit to be in leadership right now, and just trying to humbly encourage like the people that go to Trinity to do some exploring and some investigating and kind of searching their own consciences. And so some have, some haven't. But yeah, he's still in ministry for the time being. So, and it's hard, to be sure. So, but yeah, we can get into that. But okay, so just some lessons. So kind of a preamble here. One is I get that there may be some crossover between like what I've described my experience and like what some of y'all have experienced. And so I don't want to, if I come across judgy or preachy at all, like let me apologize up front. And if you take it that way, please come grab me after, because I want to make it right, because that's not my heart at all. So keep that in mind. The things that I'll talk about are just things that are on my heart, but there's a lot of lessons probably embedded in what I just shared. So just take them. Take your own lessons, right? You don't need mine necessarily. But the first thing that I would say is that there were two really big tragedies that came out of the fall of Mars Hill. One, the big one is just that it dragged the reputation of the gospel through the mud. There's not really any other way to put it. The American church, you guys, if you don't know, like has a reputation problem as it relates to hypocrisy. Don't know if you know, but now you know. Okay, events like that, things like Mars Hill, don't help that. They make it worse, right? So that's a huge tragedy in my view. I'm someone who cares a great deal about the unbelieving world and the lost world that we inhabit, and I'm someone that I wish the church could do better, and we didn't in that regard. But the other thing that I still kind of live with is there were an incredible number of people who were part of Mars Hill, some of whom were elders and pastors and leaders and all that kind of stuff, who, when it folded down, it took their faith with it. There are a lot of people who have renounced the gospel in the name of Jesus, like in their life, specifically because of that. There are people who are still hanging on like by a thread, but who have sworn they will never step foot in another church again, ever. That is an immense tragedy for me, at least. Like, God's grace, like that hasn't been my story. Like I love the church, and hopefully I will for the rest of my life, but it's just that's really hard. And so my encouragement, I guess, to each of you guys is you have been saved into a person, the person of Jesus. You have not been saved into a faith system. You've not been saved into a church. Okay? Those things are beautiful and wonderful and loving byproducts of being in Christ, but you have been saved into a person. Please remember that. Okay. Humbly, please don't elevate your leaders into positions of priest that they can't handle. Humbly, I think that part of the dynamic that fed into like people's faith completely exploding from Mars Hill is they had unknowingly allowed this sort of priest dynamic where like Mark and the rest of us, like we needed to mediate their relationship to Jesus, right? There needed to be this middleman, right? There wasn't a direct connection, to Jesus. And when that happens, like it's just dangerous. And I know, John's not here, but I think I can speak for him and for Todd and for Brandon and for Oscar. Like these guys, like they don't want to be celebrities. Like these are faithful men, like who want to love you and want to like walk alongside you guys, but like don't like foist upon them these expectations of like my faith is hanging on your performance. Like it's just it's hard, and it's one of those things that I don't think many of us like set out to do, but it's just like this slow kind of like gentle creep. And so I was mindful of Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 1. You guys hopefully kind of know a little bit of the background of 1 Corinthians. I mean, the church in Corinth was pretty wild, right? So these guys get saved, and Paul's like first letter to them is like, okay, we gotta start to rein in like some of this craziness, that's happening here. But the first thing that he goes after in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, the first things are divisions in the church and this sort of campism, right, that started to develop. And so he says, like in verse 12, he says, what I mean is that each one of you says, I follow Paul, or I follow Apollos, or I follow Cephas, or I follow Christ. Is Christ divided? Was Paul crucified for you? Or were you baptized in the name of Paul? I thank God that I baptized none of you except Crispus and Gaius, so that no one may say that you were baptized in my name. I did baptize also the household of Stephanas. Beyond that, I do not know whether I baptized anyone else. For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. All right? And so Paul is talking about here, like, what happens when we start kind of putting our faith in men is that the cross becomes emptied of its power. Right? It's subtle. It's subtle. But that's why I'm mentioning it now, is just have some awareness. Right? Have some awareness. Hebrews chapter 4 talks about, starting in verse 11, about how Jesus is our great high priest. 4, 5, 6, I mean, the priesthood of Jesus is definitely a theme in the book of Hebrews, but just one section says, let us therefore strive to enter that rest so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. Verse 14. Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need. Right? So just a reminder, Jesus is our great high priest. We need no other men to mediate our relationship to him. We have direct access to him through the Spirit. Take it. Take it. It's better that way. Life is better that way. Okay? That ties into my second encouragement. Know Jesus as healer. Know him as healer. Okay? If someone were to ask, tell me about the offices that you feel like Jesus holds, right? Probably say things like Lord, Savior, King. These are all right and good and biblical, right? But I think a lot of times, like, at least for us men, like, who tend to be very stoic and I'm strong and I can just push through anything, like, we fail to know and engage with Jesus as our healer. Okay? It's okay to be hurt, to be let down, right? If it's not our pastor, it might be our dad, right? Or it might be our wife, or it might be, someone else. But I think in general, like, as men, sometimes we just have a hard time just stepping into that place of just saying, like, I'm hurting right now. I'm hurting, and I'm here to tell you guys, I've lived this, like, through this experience. Like, Jesus is good. Like, he is kind. Just being in his presence, just following him, walking with him, he is an agent of healing. He is. And if you don't know that, if you haven't experienced that, that's okay. But press in. Like, come, talk to me. Talk to other, like, dudes in your life that know him, and say, like, man, I want to experience, like, what does it look like for Jesus to be my healer? And I think one of the verses that comes to mind with this is Psalm 73, 25 and 26, and it's really simple, but it's a psalm that I come back to, and the psalmist just says, he says, "Who have I in heaven but you? There's nothing on earth that I desire but you. My heart and my flesh may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever." Right? This is the prayer of a person who is rightly oriented to his God. Right? My heart and my flesh may fail. Right? What else can you add to that list? My heart, my flesh, my pastor, my dad, my church. All of these things may fail, but God is the strength of my heart and my portion forever. Who have I in heaven but you? There's nothing on earth that I desire but you. Right? And I think the lesson there is just like, if our chief and utmost affections are on Jesus, we can be let down. Not saying it doesn't hurt, but we can be let down by our church and our pastors and still make it and be okay. And it's worth it. It's worth it. Next one is, I guess, just a question. Do you have the gift, or do you practice the spiritual discipline of self-examination? A lot of us think we do, but we don't. Right? We're good at examining other people. Oh, do you see that, like, relational dynamics between those two guys? It's like, and everything is always like out here, but are you able to just like turn it and look at yourself and see like who am I, like, down here? Like, what drives me? Like, what are my pitfalls? Like, what are my dangers? And that kind of stuff. I'm so thankful that the Springs, like, hammers community and accountability. That's a good thing. I celebrate that. I think a lot of the times when we think about accountability, we think of just like the big sins, purity and porn and anger and, all that kind of stuff. But I would submit to you guys, particularly if you aspire to spiritual leadership of any kind, have men in your life ask you questions about how and where you long for power. Right? Like I said before, the fundamental lie that I think that Mark believed was that Mars Hill was his little kingdom, right? That he got to be king over. Where in your life do you want to be king? Could be work, could be your family. I see it in myself all the time at home. My son is sitting right there. He can tell you all about it. Okay? That there are just times, like in my weakness, I just feel like my home is my domain, and I want it to go the way that I want it. Right? And that's gross, because you know what the truth is? Like, my son who's sitting right there is not my son. He's God's son. I get to, like, be his steward and his shepherd, like, for a time in this life, but that is God's son. Right? It's the exact same thing is, like, true of the church. Like, this is Christ's bride. And the men who lead here, they're just responsible for being stewards and servants of it. So self-examine, like, it's easy, to look at Mark and be like, oh, what an idiot, and like, I would never, no. Well, you never know. You never know. You start getting, like, praise and accolades, and you start getting interviews, and you start getting known, and you become a celebrity. You never know what can happen. But, I think having a degree of just self-awareness and the ability and the willingness to practice the spiritual discipline of self-examination, it just helps guard against that. It just does. It just does. The last thing I would say, gentlemen, is pray for your leaders and your elders. The men that lead this church are godly. Like, I'm here for a reason. You guys should know that when my wife and I came, we sat down with John and I asked him some pretty blunt, just poke in the chest questions, that are shaped by this experience that I've just outlined. And not only like did he respond in a way that was encouraging, but he invited it. He was okay with being asked. Right? A lot of guys would have been like, "Who are you? You literally just stepped foot in the church 5 minutes ago, and you're asking me about like where I struggle, like, if I struggle sinfully with like attention and all this kind of stuff, like the door's over there, man, like get out of here, And he didn't. He was like, yeah, open book, unzipped, let's go. What do you want to know? And that's a good thing. Like that should really, really be an encouragement. But the reality is that leading is hard. If you don't know, like you got elders here, ask them. Like it's hard, right? You got people all the time that just come up and just say like, you know what? Not good enough. It sucks because you pour out your life and you're doing the best you can and you repent when you can. And for some people, it's just not, and it's hard. So pray for these guys, right? Because there's pitfalls all over the place, right? Some that you can see, some that you can't. But it's hard. There's a lot riding on it. So, I think those are my big takeaways. I've tried to keep this as brief as I can because I know you guys will have some Q&A that I definitely want to open up to. I'm an open book, so like ask whatever you want. If you guys are curious, like I want to do my best to answer them. But also just humbly, please take to heart like the encouragements, I guess, that I've given you, and try and keep that the main thing. Like I'm sure there's like some curiosity, pieces there, but I don't want this necessarily to like devolve into like a real like, I don't know, kind of weird gossipy, type of thing either. So just help me, I guess, with that. So yeah, I'll leave it open. Aaron.
How did that affect you and your family as for the church you chose to serve at, just decided to peace out?
Yeah, good question, man. So the question is, how did that impact our family? Yeah, it was hard. There's a couple of dynamics I think that God in His mercy sort of had in play to help protect us. One is that my wife and I, we kind of joke about this when we tell this story, like more conversationally, like one off, but it's like it was at Mars Hill that we learned about total depravity. And so like one of the first things that we learned is like, oh, sin has infected every part of the human experience. So it would logically follow that sin would have the potential to destroy anything and everything that's beautiful in the world, including the church that I love so much, right? And so when it happened, there wasn't a sense of like, oh my gosh, how could this ever happen? Like there wasn't surprise. There was heartache, but there wasn't like, oh my gosh, I can't believe this guy let me down. I was more like, no, like I've kind of seen this coming for years, and this is sort of what happens when like we don't, pursue repentance. And so there was that piece. The other piece for us, like more personal, I think, to our family, is that at the time that like everything was like starting to come down in 13 and 14, my family, we were just embroiled in a really, really hard and difficult journey into the foster care system. We, like my two youngest sons, we adopted out of foster care. It was a really hard, really brutal journey, and that was all happening in parallel, with all this stuff. And so the reality is the human soul kind of only has so much room to process like really hard things. And the reality is that the really hard stuff that was happening in my house, under my roof, just ate up more of my like heart and soul's attention than everything that was happening at Mars Hill. It was really hard, but I didn't have as much bandwidth to like even care about that stuff so much because I was experiencing other just daily hard things, over here. So yeah, it was hard, but it just didn't, like, we never ever, like, got to a place where we were like, man, I just don't know if I believe anymore, or I don't know if Jesus is good. Like, that just, God in His grace, He just spared us, from that and protected us, from that. So, yeah. David?
So Josh, first of all, thank you.
Yeah.
For just your heart and just sharing this morning. So thank you.
Appreciate that. Yeah.
I'm just curious. Did you know before the wheels came off? Did the Holy Spirit start to say questions in your mind? And the reason I ask that question is because I've had in the past where Spirit was saying, "Hey, there's something wrong here,"
Yeah.
but I failed to act on it because I was like, okay, these guys are leaders. I'm not an educated priest. I
Yep.
don't know any of this kind of stuff.
Yep.
So I'm just curious, did you ever have a sense before everything started going wrong that there were some issues out there?
Yeah, I appreciate that. And just so you guys know, like, so David actually spent some time at Mars Hill. Like, we didn't know each other there, but he used to live in Washington, so he's had some firsthand knowledge. And his question is just about, if I ever had a sense, like in advance. And to answer that, absolutely. I kind of alluded to it, but there were just so many days way before any of that stuff was on, a national sort of sense of awareness, that I could just tell, like, man, if something doesn't change, if there's not like heartache and heartbreak, and Mark's heart, if we don't begin to see him living the repentance that he has faithfully preached for so long, then yeah, like this could end, really, really poorly, and like I said before, it created just a real tension, because I didn't want to be part of something that was hurting people and that was marring the reputation of the kingdom of God, but again, just on a local, intimate, like relational level, that's where I felt like I was called, so it was hard though, to be sure. It was hard. Yeah. Fred.
So, just a little, I guess, different angle. I'm wondering if you experienced this or felt it this way. So, the main thing was Mark, your estimation, or maybe not his admission, it was his church.
Yes.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So, in my experience in ministry, I've had a number of guys I've known that have gone through this at smaller scales and
Yep.
elders.
Yep.
And a common theme, some of them didn't think it was their church,
Mm-hmm.
but they did conclude that the rules didn't apply to them. So,
Yeah.
would you speak to that maybe?
Yeah. So Fred's question is, the degree to which, Mark struggled with the rules not applying. Yeah, absolutely. The thing that comes to mind is, I remember that Richard Nixon did an interview, kind of post Watergate. I can't remember the guy's name. I think he was like English or something like that. And the guy just kind of kept pressing him on the whole like Watergate thing. And basically, I'm what's that? Yeah, I think it was Frost. Yeah. And I'm paraphrasing, but basically, like Nixon argued that like everything he did was okay because he was the president, and the president can make his own rules, right? And we definitely saw that dynamic. Yeah, with Mark, and one of the what's the word I want to use? Just one of the carrots. I don't even know I can't think of the right category for it. But one of the things that we just always like heard and felt all the time was like, if you're gonna make an omelet, you got to break some eggs, And like God was manifestly doing something remarkable through Mars Hill. Like what you guys have I didn't talk about before. You have to understand is that the Pacific Northwest is like statistically, demographically, one of the least churched areas like in the United States. Like it is just hostile to the gospel, right? So this whole like kind of like cultural Christianity that you get in the South, there's none of that up there, right? It's just, it's very, very different. And so the fact that like Mars Hill was growing the way that it was, right? And was like this fountainhead of influence the way that it was in the city that it was just a big deal. And so it created this like sense of like kind of righteous wind in your back of like, man, like God is doing something, really remarkable here. Well, in order to do that, like, yeah, we're going to have to run over some bodies, like, yeah, it's going to cost some things. Yeah, we're going to have turnover and, all these different things. And so it was like this spirit of justification, and again, it flew in the face of integrity, and it was hard too, because, one of the other underlying things is that it stopped, it really stopped being a church and became more of an organization, And I still don't know, like people, you can debate about, whether or not like multi-site, multi-campus churches and all that stuff are legit. And I don't know, the plane hasn't landed on that. But I will say that anytime you start going, multi-site and all that kind of stuff, you get that organizational creep, where it just becomes harder for it to be a church and it feels a little bit more like an organization or a company.
Maybe over a certain size.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. It begs the question, like, are mega churches like even legit? I don't know. It's above my pay grade. Yeah, Todd.
Was there a sense of, because you were witnessing lives being changed,
Yes.
you were seeing the good side
Yeah.
on a local, intimate level.
Yep.
Was there a sense among the leadership of needing to protect the brand and protect Mark
good that was
Yes.
happening. And they, even though they were experiencing the bad behind closed doors, like was there for a while, this sense of, okay, we got to keep that behind closed
Yeah.
doors because we don't want to ruin
Yes.
all that. I mean, it seemed like that would be an easy
Yes.
thing to fall into instead of immediately almost holding leadership to a higher standard.
Yes.
Oh, let's keep that.
Yes. That's exactly right. Yeah. Yeah. So Todd's observation is just around, protecting the brand and just that tension that exists. And that was the hardest part about leading there. Was doing that. I can't even tell you guys like how many times like I got asked to just come visit a community group, that I'd helped start, and they're like, hey, can you just come and talk? And I'm like, yeah. And so I'd, show up, and again, I had my own community group. And so, I mean, in these days, like I'm not home like 3-4 nights a week, cause I'm just like all over the place, and I'd go and sit down, and it would be like 18 people, and they're just like, what the hell is going on? Like why did he do that? And I'm in this tough position of wanting to like call sin, but also, keep the wheels on the bus, I'm like, well, like, yeah, like, he was having a hard day, and, grace to thee, and, I mean, it's just like all these little, like, pithy, things, but yeah, it was hard. It was hard, yeah, and I believe me, I crapped the bed more than once, in some of those meetings. Hang on a sec. Mark. Then Pete, I'm going to come back to you.
What personal toll did you see it take on you, your wife, your family?
Yeah, good question. Personal toll that it took. I think just fatigue was probably a big one, because as again, so much of what, this happened in concert with just some other just really hard stuff, at home. And so it just created this sense of just, like, I don't know, like I've talked to doctors, I don't know if like adrenal fatigue is a thing. Some doctors say it is, some it isn't. I sure feel like it is, because I just felt like, I still, to some degree, like I still feel like my body just doesn't like handle stress the right way from that season, like I just, I keel over easier and faster than I should, when stuff, in life, is hard. But, I would say that's the big one. Like I said, just God in His mercy, like just really preserved our view, of Him and His goodness, through that. And we got the opportunity to help start, another church kind of right out of the ashes of that. Like two of the guys that I served with at Bellevue, they were kind of moved to the exit a little bit before I was, kind of at the end. And so they said like, hey, we can see this thing's going to shut down. Like there's going to be, just in Bellevue, like over 1,000 refugees, basically that aren't going to have a church home. And so they decided to get a church going. And so was privileged to get to help with that. And, I wasn't an elder there, but I was on what we called like the starter board. So I kind of got to serve in sort of an accountability function with those guys, help write the bylaws, just sort of set the governance and the theology and just got it going, and that was really beautiful, like it was nice. It felt sort of redeeming, to do that and just to be reminded of the beauties of the local church again, I guess. Yeah. Sorry, you had something.
I wanted to ask your view about the church that was enabling him, and where the responsibility of the church is there, what fine balance there is between keeping, I don't want to say control of the pastor, and letting the pastor be himself. Too.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Just about like kind of that accountability, dynamic and what it looks like for like an organization to be faithful in that way. The word that kind of comes to mind for that is wisdom. I think you got it. Like every church expression, again, it goes back to that sense of self-examination. Like even churches can self-examine and say like, what are our danger points here? Like what potential weaknesses like could the enemy, exploit, to blow this thing up, and then to create sort of structures or systems like around that to help, protect against it, but fundamentally, like there's a reason why God, like in the New Testament, says that the church should be led by a plurality of elders. There's a reason for that, right? And the accountability piece is one of those things. And again, like you guys should know, like I think like John is a like immensely like deep character, and he's someone that I trust and will follow for a long time. But if he starts to go sideways, these guys are going to rein him in. I believe that because they love the gospel more than they love John and his reputation, right? That's important. that is important. You have to, like, the church has to be led by men who have enough spine and like backbone to be willing to do hard things like that, you know? And similarly, to be willing to filter out and keep people from leadership that they see, just to have that bend, have that lean. It's like, there's just some people that legit love the Lord, but they love power too, and you can just see it and you can smell it. And those people shouldn't be in leadership just in the near term, you know, until that's something that God comes and can start to redeem, you know. So, but yeah, there's not a one size fits all, you know, piece there. I just think, you know, you use wisdom and you use like the direction that God has given us in the New Testament about how like the church should be ordered and structured, and you do the best you can.
I asked that question in the background that I come from a denomination that has a rule book that is as thick as the Bible.
Wow.
If not thicker.
Wow.
And then another book of judicial decrees based on the rules, based on the Bible. It gets out of hand.
Yeah, it can. Yeah, there's some fairly like simple principles that if you adhere to, things tend to go okay. You don't need to overcomplicate it, I don't think. Yeah. So yeah.
Kind of piggyback on the denomination portion of that. What's your opinion of the autonomy of the church?
Yeah.
Because not just Mars Hill, but a lot of churches kind of, you know, over the past 10 to 15 years have kind of come down, smaller sizes.
Yep.
There was a lot of hurt amongst congregations that drove people back to the denominational church because of the structure. What sort of structure, one, the autonomy of the church question, and then I'm going to piggyback on what you were saying, what sort of structure should a non-denominational church focus on to ensure there is kind of a pluralistic eldership?
Yeah. So the question is just around church structure and denominations and all that stuff. I don't know. I consider myself something of an ecumenicalist, right? So I just try and like find the beauty and the goodness in every church expression that's out there. Like I think I love Lutherans and I love Presbyterians and Baptists, and like I don't know, like I think there's something awesome like to be found. It's funny that you mentioned that because in the podcast after they finished all of the like the episodes specific to Mars Hill, there's been a bunch of bonus episodes that I really recommend. But one of them they had Tim Keller on. Tim Keller is like, as far as I'm concerned, he's like the man. Like he's my dude. But he talked about kind of that like ecumenical sort of spirit of like, man, like, you know, he goes, I'm Presbyterian, and he talked really openly about like, hey, here's what we do well, here's what we don't, and here's what I can learn from my Baptist brothers, you know, and sisters, and, you know, all that kind of stuff. And so I kind of come more from like that perspective of just like, I think that God has given us freedom. Like the New Testament actually doesn't have a whole lot of like real rigid detail about like how services should be run and how long sermons should be and all that kind of stuff. And so I think we're given freedom, and I think it's actually kind of beautiful to see the diversity of like the way that faith is expressed in different faith communities. But yeah, kind of going back to what I was saying before, like it has to be done with wisdom. I definitely think that there should be some security to be found, like being part of a denomination, just knowing that there's other sort of governing bodies that care about a church and are looking into it and like can be appealed to and all that kind of stuff. But I still am someone who believes like fundamentally local plurality of elders like really should be structured in such a way that everything can be handled there. It's certainly possible that a whole team of elders could go off the rails together. And if and when that happens, then usually, a church is probably going to just go away entirely. But I think if a plurality is functioning the way that it's supposed to, there will just be a natural sort of rhythm of kind of self-correction and you know, all of that hopefully will protect the reputation of the church and the good of the body and, you know, all that kind of thing. But like I said, it's hard. It's hard, and we've got lots of examples, you know, of this thing going sideways. I mean, I don't know if, you guys can read stuff online, but yeah, Aaron. Yeah. So the question is, what was my faith journey like? It's been a windy road. Yeah, it's not. I just don't feel like the Mars Hill stuff like has been like the thing that's pressed on me. Like for me, you know, the suffering is, or the more shaping things have just been like suffering associated with our journey as foster parents. You know, it was just a really hard road, and so that was more the thing that made me. I don't know, you guys ever like angry pray? Like I do all the time, but just like, have you ever prayed like, what are you doing? Like every week for me. Some of you guys are like, what? Oh, I would never. Like that's my king. I'm like, well, okay, but like, like my experience as a foster parent, I think like more like takes me to that place, than Mars Hill. But fundamentally, like the theme, like for me, is God's faithfulness in the face of my faithlessness. That's it. Like I can't even tell you like how often I pray like, thanks Steve, how often I pray like, I can't do this right. Like I can't do it. And God meets me there. And I think one of the probably the most helpful, kind of stirring, like impactful things that I've read, like since all this, is a book called Gentle and Lowly. If you guys haven't read that, like buy it like this week. It's so tremendous. It's written by, I think, is it Dane Ortland? It's one of the Ortland kids, one of Ray's kids. And it is just a tremendous look at just all the Bible has to say about just the gentleness and the lowliness of Jesus, and how he like draws near to us in the midst of our weakness and our inability to do it right. It's a really, really beautiful like explanation and picture of the gospel that kind of takes it several levels deeper than just like Jesus saved you from your sin, which he has, but there's more to it than that. There just is. So yeah, I recommend that. So yeah, Brandon. Yeah, no, appreciate it. Thank you.
My question is, with Mars Hill, there's all the destruction and things that went on. Clearly, there were good things.
Yeah.
Speak a little bit into those good things, specifically with on the West Coast and this kind of softness, the immature believer, and Mark really did well, like kind of calling that out.
Yeah.
What are some of the teachings and principles that you would bring here, or could bring here, but that you would advise that you learned there from Mars Hill to call men up?
Yeah.
Be men God has
Called them to be. Yeah, good question. Yeah. So the question is just around what are the good kind of positive takeaways, from our time at Mars Hill, particularly as it relates to men and all of that. Yeah, so I'm still a complementarian at heart. I also hold it very, very gently in my hands, realizing that complementarianism can be done really poorly and in a way that hurts and degrades women, and that happened a lot at Mars Hill, and it grieves me. But I think. Fundamentally, to answer kind of the first part of your question in terms of what I saw, like the story that I told of my own was just replicated literally hundreds and thousands of times in the lives of others. I mean, some of my best friends still to this day are guys that I met there who came into the church like me, just kids, just knuckleheads, just loved playing like video games and like just couldn't care less about responsibility and just like absolutely no sense whatsoever about like, man, like how God might want to use me and, all that kind of stuff. And so, I think just pressing in and kind of understanding like what the whole picture of like biblical manhood looks like. It's okay. Like I think a lot of guys just have this like sort of internal masculine drive, but it's hard to define. It's like, what does it mean? And like, what can I do with it? And like, what's godly and like, what's not? And so I think like what Mark and like Mars Hill did so well, especially early on, was just sort of like taking that and channeling that, into just like this, I don't know, just a biblical picture of manhood, that just sort of demonstrated that like, we need to think of like all of our domains and areas of life as gardens, and like it is our job to create flourishing, in those gardens, right? And that's what leadership and headship is, right? It's not authority, right? Like, Paul, here, there's this one verse, in 2 Corinthians, it gets passed over all the time, but in 2 Corinthians chapter 1, the very end of the chapter. So Paul he opens 2 Corinthians talking about, kind of like his earlier visits, right? And he's sort of referencing like, man, you guys just kind of went sideways, and I love you, but you're killing me, and just the way that you're living and all that kind of stuff. And so he's referencing his earlier visit and how like, tensions were a little bit, heightened and all of that. But then he says, it's so interesting how he says it in verse 23 of 2 Corinthians 1. He says, "But I call God to witness against me. It was to spare you that I refrained from coming again to Corinth. Not that we lord it over your faith, but we work with you for your joy. For you stand firm in your faith." Right? And so what's in view there is like Paul's talking about his spiritual authority, right? And he's saying the purpose of it is not to lord it over people. Like that's not why God gives like spiritual authority to men, right? It's to work with people, come alongside, come under, to prop up, to faith. And I just think that verse like gets, passed over a lot. And so I think like that principle can and should be applied like for every man, right? Like the dominion, I guess, that God has given, the responsibility that He's given, it's there to promote flourishing, in every way, and just like giving men, I think, the freedom and the opportunity to kind of plug into that manhood, but to use it and to channel it like towards stewardship and flourishing, I think is key. So, yeah.
I appreciate you sharing about your own weakness in the pride of the title.
Yeah.
Say I'm an elder here.
Yep. No, that was definitely part of it.
Can you share with us what your journey was like away from that trap of pride?
Yeah.
And how we can avoid that in our own lives?
Yeah. So the question is just around, just being aware of that kind of trap of pride that comes. I don't know. I mean, for me, I think it just comes down to like what is like the utmost, the chief of our affections. I think that was one of the things that being part of Mars Hill just like helped me with, is it forced it kind of like the heat turned up so hot that it boiled off a lot of the impurities, right? And it was and me and a lot of other people were left to ask, what really counts? What matters? And had to answer that honestly, right? And thankfully, like by and large, like it was, like I said before, it was just our identity, in Jesus, and the fact that we were in Him. I don't know, man. For me, I think, I stepped in it so many times. I mean, there's so many meetings and things that I just wish I could go back and redo, that, I don't know, you get in that cycle and you see that enough, like in your own life and your own heart and character, and you can't help but just like experience humility through that. At least that's just the way that I'm wired, and I get that some guys aren't, and they just keep smashing into the same thing, keep doing the same thing, and, bombs are going off and grenades are going off everywhere. That's just, God in His grace has just wired me a little bit different, where I just, I want to see the name of Jesus like glorified in the world immediately around me. And when that doesn't happen, I grieve it, so, yeah. I know that might not be as direct answer as you want, but that's just, that's the way I interact with it. So, yeah, what's up, Chuck?
When you were talking about like church denominations and stuff, it
Yeah.
kind of sparked a question.
Yeah.
I remember thinking this, like when it all kind of went down. With Acts 29, I guess it's kind of like a two-part question. Do you think it was easier for Mark to kind of like push it aside, being the president at the time, and then when did they like finally come in, like Matt Chandler, and write their letters saying,
Yep.
These are the accusations. This is why we're like having to step
Yeah,
in.
we're severing. Yeah.
Like, what was that? What did that look like?
Yeah, so the Chuck's questions around Acts 29. So Acts 29 was a church planning network that had been started. Marcel, you guys probably know, the book of Acts has 28 chapters, and so it's like, oh, we'll have a little, extra, 29th chapter. And it was just a church planning network, where, Mark basically wanted to create this vehicle to plant like-minded churches, right, to be able to replicate, what Marcel was doing, but in other parts of the country. And so I think the motivation was good, initially. It grew to such a degree that it almost kind of functioned like a denomination in some ways. I mean, it's a church planning network, but it had the look and feel, in many ways of a denomination, just because of guys really had to adhere to a certain kind of theological, tribe and different stuff like that. But in terms of how it all kind of went down, like the first part of your question was about, like kind of Mark's involvement in terms of like, can you repeat that? I just want to make sure I have that.
He was the president at the time, right?
Yeah. So when it first started, Mark was like the main guy, but then before it had been kind of pushed out of Mars Hill, there was a series of other guys who were kind of like the executive directors of it, right? So Mark kind of became more of like a, I don't know, chancellor emeritus or, whatever you want to call it, more of that kind of symbolic figurehead, but there was other people that were more like directly responsible for the administration of it, and I think that was good for a while, but unfortunately still a lot of the negative cultural pieces that existed in Mars Hill did transfer over, right? And so there are a boatload, of Acts 29 churches out there that have since closed or that their pastors are, need to be in like a restoration process and all that kind of stuff, because it definitely drew that more like hardcore alpha, like Mark Driscoll wannabe type, right? And early on, like that was celebrated. It since had been tempered. And just for the rest of you guys, if you don't know, like, so Matt Chandler is a pastor up in Dallas, and so after everything was kind of started to go sideways, in Mars Hill, like leadership was kind of moved over to Chandler, and then like one of the hardest days of the church was when the news broke that Acts 29 had basically pushed Mark and Mars Hill out of its own network. Right? So the church that started it got shoved out, because of all of the, the revelations and stuff that were happening. And that was hard, but that was a good day. A lot of us inside were like, yes. And I remember like one of the harder meetings that I was ever in was with just the local eldership team, in Bellevue, and there was one guy that was on that team who had a personal relationship with Matt and emailed him back and was like, thank you. Like, this is so hard, but thank you for doing that. That was the right thing. And one of the other guys that was on the team, so we had like, there was kind of like camps, like there were guys that were like pro Mark, defend him to the death, like just ride it out, and other guys like me that were just like, God, we love this church, but stuff's got to change, kind of thing. And one of the other guys that was in like the pro Mark camp, like got a hold of that email and it's just like, oh, he betrayed us and, all this kind of stuff. And so it's just like, it's hard. Yeah, but that was part of it. Yeah.
Hey, Josh, thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
And I know this probably dredges up all kinds of range of emotions.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks, Mark. Yeah.
I didn't know anything about Mars Hill.
Yeah.
Until a mutual friend of ours.
Yeah, that's right.
Me to Mars Hill.
Yep.
Several years ago, and so seeing that restorative process from one of those executive leaders.
Yes.
It's just been very unique. So it was really exciting for us whenever our families kind of, hey, where are you coming from? Like, what?
Whoa. Yes, sir. Yeah.
But I don't really have a question. I just want to say that we're very blessed to have your perspective. You and I have talked a little bit about what that means. It's so empowering to have eyes wide open. And I'm sorry that you and several others had to go through that Mars Hill experience and are still going through it. But so thankful that the learnings from that get to be applied to Springs Community
Yes,
Church.
sir. Yeah. Me too.
It's so rich and it's so powerful.
Yep.
And I can say to the men of the group, nothing that Josh would ever say, but from a very unique perspective of an executive leader who happens to be one of my best friends after all of this, just his edification and gonna make Josh uncomfortable, but the way Josh walked through that. So I have a very unique perspective because a mutual friend of ours is a huge fan. And Josh and the Clayton family, so we're very blessed. So
Thank you, Mark.
brother.
Appreciate you.
being
Yeah.
here and sharing.
Yeah. No, it's, like I said, when I prayed, like my sincere hope for all of us is that like, as we think about this, we just see God's fingerprints, on, like he loves his church. Like he really does, and read Revelation 2 and 3. Like if you're not sure, like he will close down if he needs to, and it's out of love, it really is. And I think, there's still a lot of heartache and heartbreak over people who just, they're just their view of Jesus just got marred, from this, and that's really hard. But there are also a lot of people, like, I got asked, I was talking the other day with a friend of mine who's a pastor at a Presbyterian church in the area, and I was just, he asked me if I thought that guys that were in lead, if like basically all like elders and leaders at Mars Hill were kind of like disqualified, from being there. And I said, no. I said, some certainly are. But I said, some of the guys that I know that are still in leadership are 10 times better leaders now than they were then because of all the stuff that they learned, and there's like this heightened awareness around the fragility, I guess, of like a church body and what faithful leadership looks like to come alongside people and to be patient with them, and to not be domineering, and all of that is just born out of this experience. You can read that in a book or you can live it, right? And just be completely transformed in the way that you think about like what shepherding looks like, So, yeah. Jake?
So you talked about self-examination.
Yeah.
Your encouragement.
Yeah.
Got my wheels turning. And I feel like from a business perspective, that's something that's always front of mind.
Yeah.
Think about, okay, how did this go and what should we do moving forward?
Yeah.
Personally.
Yeah.
I feel like it's a little more difficult to make sure that I continue to focus on doing that for myself.
100%.
Got my wheels spinning a lot. And I've got some ideas, but I'm curious, are there things that, routines, tools, are there things over the years that you found that have helped you continue to focus on it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Question is just around kind of that practice of self-examination. I think there's a lot of different ways that you can skin it. I'm not going to be able to point you like towards any like tools. Like for me, the two big things are just like pattern recognition. You can just look at your life and be like, man, what hamster wheels, of knuckleheadery do I find myself on that I just can't seem to like, that I'm just like, squeaky, like what, like why can't I get off that? Like just pulling back and looking at my life, like looking at those things will tell me a lot right there, right? So that's part of it. And the other part is community. Like I have dudes in my life that get to say anything and who have been given a mandate to speak into my life if they see certain patterns and stuff like that, right? And those guys help me, and you're becoming one of those guys, like I'm serious. And like, I trust that like, if like you like see something like that you love me enough to like sit me down and, hey bro, like I love you, but like, this is what I think I see. What am I seeing? Tell me what you see, and that kind of stuff. I just think like it's incumbent upon us to do that, for one another. And listen to our wives and, our kids, like, my kids like, straighten me out all the time. It's like, you're doing it again, like whatever. I'm just like, so.
Kids are good at pointing out everything you do wrong.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. Appreciate you guys. Yeah. Any other last minute questions? I do get asked, from time to time just about like the pod and like, the podcast and what I think of it. And so I guess I will say that in general, like I definitely point people to it. I think they did a good job. I think, that kind of journalism is hard, right? So it's never going to be perfect. And so I think it's incumbent upon us to approach it with just a measure of grace, and understanding, and not just like try and pick it apart and like dissect it. I don't think it was perfect. But I think they did a really good job, talking about, just the kind of cultural context stuff that created this sort of like ripe environment, for a church like Mars Hill to ascend in the way that it did. And so I think they did a really good job of that. I think the episode on sort of the complementarian thing was a little weird. I don't know. It's been a while since I've listened to it, but I just remember like coming off that kind of going like, yeah, that felt like a little bit more of a hit piece, like around complementarianism than anything else. But the main thing that was hard was just like when you listen to the pod, the sense that you get is that every week, like for the life of the church, there was some crazy crisis, like, going on, and it just wasn't that way, like up until the last year, it would be like, once a year, once every 6 months, like something would blow up, but it's like, you just can't really get from the pod, like all of that, like organic, real, just life, there's just being lived and beauty and redemption and people getting saved and, marriages getting healed and just like all that stuff that was happening that was so incredible. That just doesn't come through, in the pod that much. Yeah. Aaron?
I think that's a good point that you made. Like the reason you came to the church was because of the gospel.
Yes.
Like you can listen to the podcast and it does a good job of giving you the info that like when I was a college student when it all went down.
Yeah.
I was in college ministry as a college student. I have a lot of college guys that were engrossed in Mars Hill and doing all that stuff and everything. And so I kind of
saw it from a distance and heard like his explanation of stuff and was like, okay, well that's sad. And then hearing the podcast was like, okay, so it was a little bit more than he let on of stuff that happened.
Yeah.
But then also acknowledging like God was still working. God still
Yes.
uses
Yeah.
messy people to
Yes.
do his work.
That's exactly right. Yep.
We see that in Ravi Zacharias, who
Yep.
after he died,
All this stuff came out.
and,
Yep.
wow, did a lot of monstrous things, but God still used him.
Yep. Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned Ravi. Like, the whole Ravi revelation thing was almost harder for me than Mars Hill, if you can believe that. Because like Ravi was so like I was someone who I wrestled with a lot of doubt. You know, like coming up, you know, like I remember being a kid just like trying to figure out like where do dinosaurs fit into Genesis, and like everyone just telling me like just be quiet and just take it on faith. And I'm like there's no better answer than that, you know? And I remember like in college, like someone turned me on to, you guys know who Lee Strobel is? Like the Case for Faith, I mean, it's just like tremendous work. And so my brain is like, oh, like there's smart people out there that are believers that have good answers to hard questions. Like get out of here. Like that's great, you know? And Robbie was like one of those guys. And I remember, I was in Washington, he came and spoke at the University of Washington there. And it exploded my brain. Like I still have the audio from it like on my computer at home, and I listen to it like all the time, right? Like his quotes of like Malcolm Muggeridge and G.K. Chesterton, all this, I mean, it's just like amazing, right? And so Robbie was like super formative for me. And so like when all that stuff came out, I was just like, gosh, like is anyone like just not an idiot, you know? Like it's hard. And the answer is no. All of us are. Get on the train, boys. If you think you're not, you're deluding yourself. So sorry, Steve, you had something. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yep.
I was brought to faith by John Osteen in the mid-'80s, and didn't take long to figure out I need to find
Yeah.
new home.
Yeah.
One of my best friends
Good old Osteen.
to Christ because of Benny Hinn.
Yeah.
So, we talked about some of that stuff, how we were drawn into it because of where we were.
Yeah.
That's what it took to get us going.
Yep.
But the heart for Christ penetrates your heart and want to know it more, draws you into questioning those who are around you. So
Yeah.
it's not wrong to question your leadership.
100%.
Take the Bible and go to it and
Yep.
say, does this compare what they're saying and doing? And that's what I constantly do. And I think that helps us trust our leaders.
Yeah. Amen. It's a good word.
Well, I think in Philippians where it talks about whether it's Christ being preached in pretense or in truth, I rejoice that Christ is being preached. Just remember in the fall of churches, you said it great when you said, when I recognized the depravity of sin,
Yep.
Christ is being preached and people are saved in Benny Hinn's church, in Joel Osteen's church, and in Mars Hill, and in our church.
Yep.
Just to remember that, we're all fallen. And so one day John will pass, and I'm sure at some point someone will bring something up about our pastor.
Yep.
Hopefully not anytime soon, God willing, but
Preach it.
Things will come up.
Yeah.
And so it's exciting to see Christ move in many different ways.
Yeah, let me tell you something. That verse that you referenced in Philippians, that got kicked around a lot in the latter days, of Mars Hill. Yeah, to be sure. So. Okay. Going once, going twice. Well, thank you guys for giving me a hearing. Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
I guess maybe this isn't just an opinion, but is it just the power that does the corruption? And maybe if you ask him to judge his heart.
Yeah.
But it seems like a lot of these folks that are super successful and fail, it seems like they all start from a really good place.
Mm-hmm.
But
Yep.
that power is just so corrupting.
It's intoxicating.
Yeah. Is that how you see it? Do you think that that's maybe kind of accurate?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, you're right that we can't get into one another's hearts, but I think, for all of us, it's probably, a little bit different. I mean, there was like this revelation that came out, or not this revelation, but Mark is constantly just saying ridiculous stuff. And, I think maybe 2 weeks ago, he basically came out and said that that he was told by the elders that were investigating him that they basically threatened him by saying, hey, if you don't resign, we're going to tell everyone that you cheated on grace and you committed adultery, right? And it's a laughable, accusation, because the reality is like they didn't need that, but, the reason I mention it is like that was the one thing that, like, to our knowledge, like, Mark never, like, wandered into, like, that we know of, you know. He wandered into a truckload of other stuff, you know, but, like, that's something that I feel like is the more common, like, pitfall, right? For a lot of these guys, like, who start, you know, elevating in fame and stature and prominence and influence, all that kind of stuff, like, what do they normally go to? They normally go to, like, start, like, messing around sexually, you know, but that wasn't, that we know, like, that wasn't Mark's pitfalls. Yeah, so everybody's different, you know. It's like, so what is it? You know, I think, yeah, for him, it was just like, yeah, just that intoxication of just influence and power. And we still see that, you know, with the way that he's, you know, kind of handling himself and all that. But I think, yeah, it goes back to, like, my encouragement, like, be self-examining, like, see where you could be in danger, you know, of this, you know, yourself, because it can get any one of us. So. Cool. Okay. Appreciate it.
Listen to your story, man. There's so many times, like, I pulled out, like, our one each Springsman car there, and, like, opportunities were, like, rejecting passivity, accepting responsibility, leading courageously, and investing in terrain. Like, how many of those notes were sewn into what you're talking about?
Yeah, right.
Like,
yeah.
Man, maybe we could have not been passive and then stepped in earlier and helped this guy out, that kind of stuff. Dude, thank you for everyone showing up this morning. It's stories like this is why we come here, to learn from each other, learn from our experiences. Mark had a great story a couple months ago when he gave his. I can think of two very specific examples this week where I'm having conversations with guys, where conversations in this room equipped me to have a conversation with somebody else that was struggling with something. And so that's why I'm so thankful for this. And I think it's why it's so important for all of us to keep showing and sharing those life experiences. And just like you mentioned in the back, they're like, man, none of us are perfect, but we're working towards perfection, and we have a perfect Savior who can help us get there. So a couple of public service announcements, a couple more tacos, so feel free to take those with you. We're going to meet this Wednesday morning, right?
Yep.
6:15. A challenging topic this week. Why does God allow suffering? And so I think that is a topic that comes up a lot. And I am the fortunate one that gets to run through that lesson. I'm looking forward to hearing y'all's perspective on that and what Tim Keller has to say about it. We'll take a break after that for the Thanksgiving holiday, and then we'll come back after that. And then December 10th will be the next breakfast. And in the evening of the 10th, Robert Boyd's going to host a Maverick Top Gun night at his house, most likely. So we'll make sure we continue to pass along that information. Other men's leadership items?
Well, just a prayer request. I mean, maybe we're going to cover that with Leighton Adams, and I don't.
Yeah.
Go, please.
I don't know the latest update. Perhaps, Todd, do you have that?
For those who don't know, Leighton Adams, Cole, Jim's son, was involved in an accident. Just a short summary, he was electrocuted and fell